At 88 years old, Jane Fonda sits at a stage of life where reflection carries as much weight as the role she once inhabited on the silver screen. A woman whose name is etched into the very fabric of Hollywood history, she has lived more than one life. Daughter of Henry Fonda, the restless activist who rattled Washington, the fitness queen who transformed living rooms, and the actress whose career has spanned over 6 decades. Yet when she looks back now, it isn't the awards, controversies, or global fame that seem to matter most. Instead, it is something far quieter, more intimate, and for many years left unsaid, her bond with Robert Redford. For audiences, the story of Jane Fonda and Robert Redford has always been written in the language of cinema. From the laughter of Barefoot in the park to the quiet intimacy of Our Souls at Night, theirs was a partnership that transcended time. Every time they appeared on screen together, their chemistry felt effortless, natural in a way that could not be rehearsed. It wasn't fiery tabloid drama or scandalous affairs that tied them together, but something deeper. A trust, an admiration, a connection that lived in the subtle glances, the half-smiles, and the silences between words. What the world never knew, however, was that beneath the professional respect and artistic collaboration, Jane Fonda carried a secret of her own. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, she confessed in a rare moment of vulnerability that during those early years, she was in love with Robert Redford. Not a casual crush, not just admiration for a handsome co-star, but a quiet, persistent love she never dared to speak aloud. She admitted that even while she was navigating her own marriages, political battles, and struggles with identity, she kept this truth buried, unsure if it would change the magic they had together on screen. It is a revelation that reframes everything we thought we knew about their legendary pairing. To fans, their chemistry was obvious, but now, with Jane's confession, we understand it in a new light. Every touch in Barefoot in the park, every argument in the Electric Horseman, every late-life embrace in Our Souls at Night, they all carry the weight of an untold love story. A love that existed not in the gossip columns, but in the quiet corners of Jane Fonda's heart. This is not the typical Hollywood romance filled with broken vows and messy headlines. Instead, it is a hidden story of two people whose paths intertwined across 50 years, whose connection was real even if it was never fully lived out. And now, as Jane Fonda herself opens up at 88, we finally get to uncover the truth, that sometimes the greatest love stories are not the ones we see in the spotlight, but the ones that remain just out of reach, lingering in memory and unspoken words. Jane Seymour Fonda was born into Hollywood royalty, the daughter of Henry Fonda, one of the most respected actors of his generation, and Frances Ford Seymour, a Canadian-born socialite. From the outside, her early life looked charmed, but behind the perfect family photos and the glamorous name was a childhood shadowed by tragedy. When Jane was just 12 years old, her mother died by suicide in a psychiatric hospital. The loss left a scar that shaped her youth, leaving her caught between the weight of grief and the immense shadow cast by her famous father. Henry Fonda, known for his stoic, almost distant presence both on and off screen, was not the most emotionally expressive parent, and Jane grew up with a constant yearning for approval, love, and a sense of her own identity. She studied at Vassar, lived in Paris for a time, and eventually found herself drawn to acting almost reluctantly, as though she was stepping into a destiny written before she was ready to embrace it. It was at the Actors Studio, under the legendary Lee Strasberg, that she discovered her own potential, not just as Henry Fonda's daughter, but as a performer capable of raw, emotional truth. On the other side of the country, Charles Robert Redford Jr. was growing up in Santa Monica, California, far from the privilege that cushioned Jane's upbringing. His father worked as a milkman before becoming an accountant, and his mother's death when he was in his 20s left a lasting mark on him as well. Unlike Jane, whose life always had some connection to Hollywood, Robert's early years were defined by struggle. He was a restless kid, more drawn to art and sports than academics, and he often felt like an outsider. After high school, he briefly attended the University of Colorado on a baseball scholarship but lost his place due to heavy drinking. Searching for purpose, he traveled through Europe, painting and sketching, soaking up cultures far from his Southern California home. It was during these wandering years that the seeds of storytelling and performance began to take root. Returning to the United States, he studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, taking on odd jobs while chasing auditions, determined to carve out a place for himself in the world of acting. By the early 1960s, Both Jane and Robert had begun their ascent in Hollywood, though their paths had not yet crossed. Jane broke through with her role in the 1965 Western comedy Cat Ballou, which became a surprise hit and established her as a vibrant new star. She followed it with eclectic choices, from light comedies to daring projects, and her image as a sex symbol was solidified with the sci-fi cult classic Barbarella in 1968, directed by her then-husband Roger Vadim. Yet even in those early years of glamour and fame, Jane bristled at being reduced to her looks. She wanted to be taken seriously, to be recognized not just as a pin-up star or the daughter of Henry Fonda, but as an actress in her own right. Redford's rise followed a similar arc. He gained attention on Broadway with Barefoot in the Park, a romantic comedy that highlighted his boyish charm and comedic timing. Hollywood soon came calling, and after several smaller roles, his breakout came with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969. Playing alongside Paul Newman, Redford became an instant icon. Handsome, charismatic, the very image of American masculinity at the time. But like Jane, he too resisted the labels. He didn't want to be trapped as just another golden boy of the screen. He was drawn to characters with complexity, stories that revealed something deeper about society and human nature. By the end of the 1960s, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford were two of the brightest stars in Hollywood, each admired for their beauty and magnetism, but also restless, searching for something more meaningful in their careers. They had lived very different lives. Jane, born into Hollywood and scarred by family tragedy, Robert, the self-made artist who fought his way from the margins, but those differences only made their eventual meeting more powerful. Both had become the faces of a new generation of cinema, and it seemed inevitable that their paths would collide. When they finally did, on the set of a romantic comedy that would capture audiences' hearts, it was not just the beginning of an on-screen partnership. It was the spark of a connection that would last for decades, one that went far beyond scripted lines and staged kisses. In 1967, Hollywood was in the midst of transformation. The old studio system was beginning to give way to a new generation of actors and filmmakers who brought a more naturalistic, emotionally raw style to the screen. Into this shifting landscape came Barefoot in the Park, a romantic comedy adapted from Neil Simon's Broadway hit. The play had already been a huge success on stage, but the film version carried with it a unique promise. Two of the most magnetic young stars of the era would be paired together for the first time, Robert Redford and Jane Fonda. Redford reprised the role he had originated on Broadway. Paul Bratter, a buttoned-up, straight-laced lawyer whose sense of order is constantly challenged by his new wife's whimsical spirit. Jane Fonda stepped into the role of Corey, the free-spirited newlywed whose boundless energy, mischief, and passion pushed their marriage into a whirlwind of both comedy and conflict. The setup was simple. Two newlyweds moving into a tiny New York apartment, discovering not only the quirks of their cramped home but also the quirks of each other. But beneath the slapstick humor and sparkling dialogue, the film tapped into something timeless, the clash between order and chaos, tradition and freedom, logic and love. From the first scene they shared together, Fonda and Redford radiated a chemistry that leapt off the screen. Jane, luminous and unpredictable, played Corey with a warmth and effervescence that made audiences fall in love with her every line. Redford, handsome and tightly wound, balanced her perfectly, giving Paul just enough stiffness to make his moments of vulnerability all the more endearing. Together, they didn't feel like actors reading lines. They felt like a real couple, young and infatuated, bickering one moment and kissing passionately the next. Critics and audiences immediately noticed how natural they seemed together, how effortless the intimacy between them appeared. It was a kind of magic that could not be manufactured, and it was the beginning of one of Hollywood's most enduring screen pairings. Yet what the audience didn't know, and what Jane herself wouldn't reveal until decades later, was that there was something real fueling that chemistry. In her candid reflections much later in life, Fonda admitted that during the filming of Barefoot in the Park, she was in love with Robert Redford. She kept it hidden, never breathing a word to him, never daring to blur the line between their professional partnership and personal feelings. But she felt it, deeply, every time they laughed together between takes, every time his blue eyes caught hers during a scene. The tension of unspoken affection seeped into their performances, giving their banter an extra sparkle and their kisses an extra tenderness. Off camera, Redford was famously private. He was focused on his craft, careful with his image, and determined not to get swept up in Hollywood gossip. Jane, on the other hand, was already living a more public, turbulent life. Married to French director Roger Vadim at the time, she was balancing her career with a marriage that brought both opportunities and difficulties. The gap between her public life and her private emotions only widened as she found herself drawn to her co-star in ways she couldn't act on. She buried her feelings, allowing them to exist only in the safe confines of their fictional love story. Audiences, of course, were unaware of these private truths. For them, Barefoot in the Park was pure joy, a light-hearted romantic comedy that showcased two dazzling young stars at the peak of their youthful charm. The film was a commercial success and solidified both Fonda and Redford as leading actors of their generation. But for Jane, it marked the start of a pattern that would follow her for decades. Each time she reunited with Redford on screen, the same unspoken feelings stirred within her, never addressed, never resolved. Their partnership became a dance of closeness and distance, a relationship lived fully in fiction but never quite in reality. Looking back, it's easy to see why audiences responded so strongly to Barefoot in the Park. The film captured not just a love story written by Neil Simon, but also the invisible story playing out between two actors. Redford's quiet strength and Fonda's luminous energy collided in a way that felt authentic, charged, and timeless. And though Jane would later reveal the depth of her secret feelings, at the time it was simply left unsaid. The magic of their connection remained on screen, preserved in film reels, while behind the scenes, it lingered silently in Jane's heart. It was, perhaps, the beginning of a love story that would never be told in the traditional sense, one destined to play out not in private dinners or whispered confessions, but in front of cameras, scripted by others, immortalized for audiences who could sense something real even if they didn't know the truth. Barefoot in the Park was more than just a romantic comedy. It was the first spark of a hidden bond, the opening chapter in a decades-long story of chemistry, admiration, and unspoken love. The 1970s were a defining decade for both Jane Fonda and Robert Redford, a period when they evolved from rising stars into enduring icons of American cinema. Yet while their careers soared to extraordinary heights, their personal lives were filled with turbulence, triumphs, and tragedies that unfolded far from the glamour of the red carpet. For Jane, the decade was marked by some of the most acclaimed performances of her career and a bold transformation into one of the most outspoken activists of her time. For Robert, it was the era when he became a box office powerhouse, the kind of actor whose name alone could guarantee ticket sales, even as he guarded his private life with fierce determination. Jane began the decade with a breakthrough that cemented her reputation as a serious actress. In 1971, she starred in Clute, playing Bree Daniels, a complex call girl caught in a dangerous investigation. It was a role that demanded both vulnerability and strength, and Jane delivered a performance that stunned audiences and critics alike. For it, she won her first Academy Award for Best Actress, proving that she was more than the glamorous star of Barbarella. She was a force of depth and intelligence. Only a few years later, in 1978, she won her second Oscar for Coming Home, a searing drama about Vietnam veterans returning from war. By then, she was not only celebrated as one of the finest actresses of her generation but also known for her unflinching political voice. The Vietnam War became a turning point in Jane's life. She didn't limit herself to making anti-war films. She took her activism to the streets, traveling, protesting, and speaking out. Her infamous 1972 trip to North Vietnam, where she was photographed on an anti-aircraft gun, sparked one of the biggest controversies of her career, earning her the enduring nickname Hanoi Jane. While she later expressed regret for the photo, she never backed down from her anti-war stance. The decade was also shaped by her personal relationships. After divorcing Roger Vadim, she married political activist Tom Hayden in 1973. Their marriage produced her son, Troy Garrity, and became another symbol of her alignment with radical politics. Jane's life in the 1970s was as much about revolution as it was about cinema. She was constantly navigating the intersection between celebrity, activism, and personal identity. Meanwhile, Robert Redford was building his reputation as Hollywood's golden boy, handsome, charismatic, and bankable in a way few others were. After the massive success of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969, he became one of the most sought-after actors in the industry. The 1970s only strengthened his dominance. He starred in The Way We Were, 1973, opposite Barbra Streisand, a romantic drama that remains a cultural touchstone. He delivered charm and sophistication in The Sting, 1973, which became one of the decade's biggest box office hits. Then came All the President's Men, 1976, where he portrayed journalist Bob Woodward in the film that dramatized the Watergate scandal. The movie was both a commercial and critical triumph, further solidifying Redford as not just a star but also an actor drawn to meaningful, socially relevant stories. But while his professional life flourished, Robert's private world was marked by heartbreak. He had married Lola Van Wagen in 1958, and together they had 4 children. Yet the couple endured the unimaginable tragedy of losing their infant son, Scott, who died at just 2.5 months old. The grief lingered with Redford, even as he chose to keep such matters intensely private. Unlike Jane, whose personal life often played out in the public eye, Robert shrouded his family life in secrecy, protecting it from the relentless scrutiny of Hollywood. He disliked the celebrity machine, preferring to retreat to his home in Utah, where he nurtured a love for nature and eventually began laying the groundwork for what would become the Sundance Institute. Despite the differences in how they lived, Jane embracing the spotlight for her causes, Robert retreating from it, the two remained connected in the imagination of audiences. They were seen as contemporaries, peers who defined a generation of film, admired from a distance but rarely crossing paths in real life. Their lives were running parallel tracks, both beautiful and successful, both deeply committed to their craft, and both carrying burdens invisible to those who only saw them on the big screen. As the 1970s came to a close, Jane and Robert stood at the pinnacle of their respective careers. She had become the voice of a generation, fearless and polarizing, while he was the embodiment of Hollywood's leading man, admired for his talent and integrity. They were distant, yes, but always present in each other's worlds, circling one another like 2 stars in the same constellation, destined to align again when the time was right. By the end of the 1970s, both Jane Fonda and Robert Redford had climbed to extraordinary heights in their careers, each with Academy Awards, blockbuster films, and reputations that placed them among the most admired actors in Hollywood. Yet for all their early success together in Barefoot in the Park, more than a decade had passed before they would reunite on screen. When they finally did, in 1979's The Electric Horseman, the world saw something different. 2 performers no longer playing carefree newlyweds, but mature adults whose characters, like themselves, had lived, struggled, and carried scars. The result was a film that not only entertained audiences but also deepened the myth of their on-screen chemistry. The Electric Horseman, directed by Sidney Pollack, told the story of Sonny Steele, played by Redford, a former rodeo champion turned washed-up celebrity who now hawks breakfast cereal and wears a rhinestone cowboy outfit for a living. Jaded and disillusioned, Steele finds a chance at redemption when he decides to liberate a prized thoroughbred horse being used for corporate promotion, determined to return it to the wild where it belongs. Jane Fonda played Hallie Martin, a sharp, ambitious television reporter who chases the story and ends up entangled not only in Steele's reckless mission but also in his complicated heart. On screen, the dynamic between Redford and Fonda was unmistakably different from their youthful banter in Barefoot in the Park. This time, their characters were seasoned, wounded by life, and hesitant to trust. The romance between Steele and Hallie unfolded slowly, laced with vulnerability rather than the giddy infatuation of young love. Redford brought a weariness to his performance, a man questioning what his fame had cost him, while Fonda's Hallie combined determination with curiosity, her sharp edges softening as she began to understand the man behind the headlines. Their chemistry remained undeniable, but it had matured. Every glance, every argument, every tentative kiss carried with it a weight that only comes with time and experience. Audiences responded not just to the story but to the pairing itself. Seeing Redford and Fonda together again after more than a decade created a sense of continuity, as if 2 lives had been moving in parallel only to cross paths again. Critics praised the film for its charm and for the natural ease between its leads. What made it compelling was that neither of them played caricatures of romance. Instead, they embodied 2 adults grappling with their own demons, finding connection in spite of everything working against them. Behind the scenes, the collaboration was marked by mutual respect, though the circumstances of their lives had changed dramatically since the 1960s. Jane was now one of the most recognized political activists in America, carrying both admiration and criticism wherever she went. She was navigating her marriage to Tom Hayden, balancing her roles as mother, actress, and activist, and living under constant scrutiny. Redford, meanwhile, had grown weary of the trappings of celebrity. He preferred privacy, shuttling between Hollywood and the quiet refuge of his Utah property, where he was beginning to build the foundation of what would become the Sundance Institute. Both carried the weight of fame differently, Jane leaning into the spotlight to drive her causes, Robert withdrawing to maintain his sense of self. Yet, in spite of the differences in their personal journeys, Jane admitted later in life that her attraction to Redford remained strong during the making of The Electric Horseman. She confessed that even in those years, when she was older, more politically engaged, and more grounded in her career, the same feeling she had first experienced during Barefoot in the Park still lingered. It was never something she acted on, never something she allowed to interfere with their work, but it was real, a quiet undercurrent that infused their scenes with an authenticity audiences could feel without knowing why. For Redford, the film marked another success in a career already filled with them, though he continued to avoid speaking publicly about his personal connections with co-stars. True to his nature, he let the work speak for itself, and on screen, his connection with Jane seemed effortless, as though no time had passed since their first collaboration. The Electric Horseman was more than just another romantic drama of the late 1970s. It was a reunion of two stars whose bond had ripened with age, whose performances reflected not only the story they were telling but also the lives they had lived. It revealed what audiences already suspected, that there was something special between Jane Fonda and Robert Redford, something that went beyond scripts and cameras, something deeper and more enduring. For Jane, those feelings remained unspoken, tucked away in the private spaces of her heart, but visible to anyone watching closely. And for audiences, the film was proof that some partnerships only grow richer with time. By the dawn of the 1980s, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford had firmly secured their status as Hollywood royalty, but their careers and lives were beginning to branch in markedly different directions. The youthful energy that had defined them in the 1960s and their mature romantic chemistry in the 1970s gave way to distinct legacies that would mark the next chapter of American film history. For Jane, the new decade opened with an unexpected hit that would transform not just her career, but popular culture. In 1980, she starred alongside Lily Tomlin and Dolly Parton in 9 to 5, a comedy about three women taking on their chauvinistic boss. The film became a cultural touchstone, speaking directly to the changing workplace and women's rights in America. It was both a box office smash and a statement about female empowerment, aligning perfectly with Jane's activist spirit. Around the same time, she appeared in On Golden Pond, 1981, sharing the screen with her legendary father Henry Fonda in what would become his final film. The deeply personal project allowed Jane to address the complicated relationship she had with her father through the characters they played. The film was both a critical and commercial triumph, earning Henry an Academy Award and cementing Jane's role as not only a major actress but also as a bridge between old Hollywood and new. Beyond acting, Jane tapped into a cultural phenomenon that made her a household name in an entirely new way. In 1982, she released Jane Fonda's Workout, a fitness video that sparked a global exercise craze. The video became the highest-selling home video of its time, turning Jane into a fitness icon and creating a booming industry. What began as a way to fund her political and activist efforts soon reshaped her public image, placing her in living rooms across America. Yet, this period also came with challenges. Jane's outspoken political views, particularly her opposition to the Vietnam War and her infamous visit to Hanoi in the 1970s, continued to stir controversy. Even in the 1980s, critics labeled her Hanoi Jane, and she carried the burden of balancing her activism with her Hollywood career. Still, her resilience and determination ensured that she remained at the forefront of both entertainment and cultural conversations. Robert Redford, meanwhile, was charting an entirely different path. In 1980, he made his directorial debut with Ordinary People, a searing family drama about grief and alienation. The film stunned Hollywood, earning Redford the Academy Award for Best Director and establishing him as one of the most serious creative forces of his generation. Rather than simply resting on his star power as one of the most bankable actors of the 1970s, Redford pivoted into shaping stories from behind the camera, a move that would define much of his career from then on. But perhaps his most enduring contribution during this time was the founding of the Sundance Institute in 1981, named after his iconic role in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Through Sundance, Redford nurtured independent filmmakers, giving them a platform to tell stories outside the constraints of the Hollywood studio system. What began as a workshop soon grew into the Sundance Film Festival, which by the end of the decade had become the premier showcase for independent cinema worldwide. This commitment to fostering new voices set Redford apart, solidifying his legacy not only as an actor and director but also as a philanthropist and cultural architect. Though their professional pursuits diverged, Jane thriving as an actress, fitness mogul, and activist, Robert as a director and champion of independent film, their paths inevitably crossed in the industry. They remained aware of each other's work, both admired and respected in their separate spheres. Jane's fitness empire and Redford's Sundance Institute symbolized two very different types of influence, yet both were rooted in innovation and a refusal to conform to Hollywood's expectations. Romantically, they continued to build lives with others. Jane was married to activist and politician Tom Hayden for most of the decade, while Redford remained fiercely private about his personal life, though he quietly endured heartbreak and change. Yet, through award shows, mutual friends, and the occasional professional overlap, the threads of their connection persisted. By the close of the 1980s, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford were no longer just stars. They had become icons, each shaping the cultural landscape in unique ways. Their journeys had taken them down different roads, but the admiration and chemistry that had once sparked on screen remained an undercurrent, waiting for the right project to bring them back together. By 2017, more than 50 years had passed since Jane Fonda and Robert Redford first lit up the screen together in Barefoot in the Park. Both were now in their 80s, carrying the weight of extraordinary careers, global recognition, and lifetimes of triumph and heartbreak. When Netflix announced that the two legends would reunite for Our Souls at Night, audiences immediately recognized the significance. It wasn't just another film, it was a reunion that felt like destiny, a chance to see one of Hollywood's most cherished pairings one last time. The film, adapted from Kent Harriff's novel, told a quiet, deeply human story. Redford played Louis Waters, a widower who had settled into the lonely routines of old age in a small Colorado town. Fonda portrayed Addie Moore, a widow who, tired of solitude, makes a bold and vulnerable proposal, that they spend their nights together, not for romance at first, but simply for companionship, to have someone by their side in the dark. What unfolds is a tender, late-in-life love story that explores intimacy, memory, and the courage to embrace connection even in the twilight years. On screen, their chemistry was as undeniable as ever, though shaded now by the fragility of time. Gone was the youthful exuberance of Barefoot in the Park or the fiery independence of the Electric Horseman. Instead, what they shared in Our Souls at Night was gentleness, humor, and the kind of understanding that only comes with decades of life lived. Every smile between them, every touch, carried the weight of history, not just the characters' histories, but their own. For audiences, the experience felt like watching two old friends who had walked parallel paths finally sit down together, sharing a love story that seemed as much theirs as it was their characters. Behind the scenes, Jane Fonda spoke with remarkable candor about what the film meant to her personally. She admitted openly that throughout her life she had been in love with Robert Redford, though she had never confessed it when they were younger. In interviews, she half-joked that she wished she had kissed him more in their earlier films, a bittersweet acknowledgement of feelings left unspoken for decades. At 80, she no longer carried the same need for secrecy. Instead, she reflected with honesty and vulnerability on the bond they shared. Her confession added another layer to the film, making it not just a work of fiction but also a glimpse into a love story that might have been. Robert Redford, ever more reserved, didn't match Fonda's confessional tone, but his admiration for her was no less profound. He described Jane as one of his favorite co-stars, praising her courage, intelligence, and the ease with which they worked together. For him, there was something effortless about their connection. It didn't need to be manufactured or forced. Whenever they reunited on screen, the spark was simply there, unshakable even after decades apart. The poignancy of Our Souls at Night came not only from the story but from the awareness that it was their final collaboration. Both stars were at an age where retirement loomed large, and Redford, in particular, had already signaled his intention to step away from acting. Their reunion, then, wasn't just about two characters finding love late in life, it was a farewell gift to audiences, a closing chapter to one of Hollywood's most quietly enduring partnerships. For fans who had followed their journeys since the 1960s, the film felt like an answer to a question that had lingered for years. What if Jane Fonda and Robert Redford had been given the space to play out a love story, not in fragments scattered across decades, but in full? In Our Souls at Night, they finally did. The story's simplicity, two people choosing to spend their nights together to ward off loneliness, became something grander because of who was telling it. It was, in many ways, the love story that could have been theirs, played out in fiction but grounded in the reality of their mutual affection. When the credits rolled, audiences were left not only with the satisfaction of a touching film but also with the emotional resonance of watching two icons bring their shared history to a gentle, poetic conclusion. Their final screen pairing was not about spectacle or youthful passion but about companionship, honesty, and the profound beauty of connection at any age. For Jane Fonda and Robert Redford, Our Souls at Night was more than just a film, it was a goodbye, a love letter, and the last dance of a pair who had always been better together. At 88 years old, Jane Fonda revealed a truth that had lingered unspoken for decades, a confession that seemed to rewrite the history of one of Hollywood's most beloved on-screen pairings. In candid interviews, she admitted that during the years she and Robert Redford were working together, she had been in love with him. It wasn't a passing crush, nor was it a publicity stunt. It was a deeply felt affection she never confessed, carried quietly through the prime of her life and career. For fans who had long sensed there was something special about the way she looked at him on screen, her words confirmed what had always seemed too real to be acting. Her honesty made headlines around the world. To hear an icon like Jane Fonda speak so vulnerably about unspoken love, especially at an age when most people are reflecting on what has been rather than revealing new truths, was both moving and disarming. She admitted that back in the 1960s, while filming Barefoot in the Park, she had fallen for Redford but chose not to share it with him. Fear, shyness, or perhaps the belief that it would complicate their working relationship kept her silent. She carried on with her life, marriages, activism, motherhood, a legendary career, while that secret affection remained tucked away. Looking back, Jane described what it was like to work with Redford in terms that went far beyond professional admiration. She said he made her feel safe, that there was a natural ease between them, a chemistry that required no effort. She spoke about how deeply emotional their connection felt whenever the cameras rolled, how their scenes together seemed to flow with an intimacy that didn't need to be scripted. For her, acting alongside Redford wasn't just a job, it was an experience of closeness that mirrored the kind of love she never dared to pursue off-screen. Redford himself never echoed the confession directly, but he never denied the closeness either. He repeatedly praised Jane as one of his favorite collaborators, a woman of courage, wit, and intelligence. Their bond, as he put it, was effortless, something that didn't need words to validate it. For audiences, this duality, Jane's heartfelt confession and Robert's quiet acknowledgement, only added to the sense of a love story that lived just beneath the surface of Hollywood's brightest lights. What made Jane's revelation so powerful was the timing. At 88, she no longer needed to protect her image or fear gossip. She had lived through marriages, divorces, triumphs, controversies, and the harsh scrutiny of the public eye. At this stage in her life, she was free to speak openly, and in doing so, she gave voice to something universal: the idea that some of the deepest loves in our lives may remain unspoken. Her words resonated with millions because they weren't just about her and Redford. They were about anyone who has ever carried silent feelings, cherishing a connection that was never fully realized. In the end, Jane and Robert's story became more than Hollywood nostalgia. It was a metaphor for unspoken love, for the way life often separates affection from action. Sometimes, the strongest emotions are never acted upon, and yet they shape us, stay with us, and define our memories as much as any fulfilled romance could. For Jane, confessing her love for Robert Redford wasn't about regret. It was about honoring the truth of her own heart and acknowledging the man who had been a quiet constant across her long, remarkable journey. From the moment Jane Fonda and Robert Redford first shared the screen in the 1960s to their final reunion more than 50 years later, Their journey together has been one of Hollywood's most remarkable stories. They began as fresh faces, Jane, the daughter of a legendary actor searching for her own identity, and Robert, a handsome young talent carving his way from California obscurity to global stardom. Their youthful spark in Barefoot in the Park showed audiences the magic of two rising stars who seemed destined to collide. Over the years, that spark never faded. It simply matured, deepened, and became something far more profound. As the decades rolled on, they grew into seasoned legends, walking very different paths yet always bound by an invisible thread. Jane built a career defined by both artistry and activism, winning Oscars while challenging political systems and reshaping how women were seen on screen and off. Robert became not only one of the most bankable actors of his era but also an acclaimed director and the founder of Sundance, a man who gave independent cinema a global stage. Their accomplishments often unfolded in separate spheres, but whenever they reunited, the world was reminded that the chemistry they shared was timeless. What made their story so unique is that it was never defined by scandal, gossip, or whispered affairs. Unlike so many Hollywood relationships, theirs wasn't about romance behind the curtain. It was about what they created in front of it. Their connection lived in the roles they played together: the giddy newlyweds of the 1960s, the weary lovers of the late 1970s, and finally, the gentle companions of our souls at night. Each stage reflected not only the characters they embodied but also the passage of their own lives. Theirs was a love story written in scripts, in stolen glances captured on film, in the rhythm of performances that felt as natural as breathing. When Jane, at 88, finally admitted that she had been in love with Redford in their youth, it gave fans a truth they had long suspected. For decades, audiences sensed there was something in the way she looked at him, something unsaid in their silences, something real behind the fiction. Her confession wasn't about regret but about honesty, about honoring a bond that had shaped her life and career. It was her way of closing a circle, of giving voice to feelings that had never disrupted their friendship but had always been part of their story. In the end, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford remind us that not every love story has to fit the mold of romance fulfilled. Sometimes, love is found in admiration, in respect, in the trust that two artists place in each other when they step in front of the camera. Their legacy is proof that intimacy can take many forms, and that some of the most enduring connections don't belong to real life at all but to the world of cinema. For audiences, their partnership will always be more than just acting. It will remain a reminder that some stories live forever on screen, where time doesn't matter, and where love, spoken or unspoken, finds its purest form. And for Jane Fonda, speaking her truth at last gave her, and all who watched her journey with Redford, a final gift. Closure to a love that may never have been lived, but that will never be forgotten.